Just days ago, on May 28, 2026, the truth finally came out in court. Vikram Digwa, the Sikh man who stabbed 18-year-old university student Henry Nowak to death, has been found guilty of murder. But the real scandal is what happened on that street that night, and what the police did while a British boy bled out in front of them. As Henry lay dying from multiple stab wounds, the attacker screamed racism and the police believed him. They handcuffed the dying teenager instead of saving his life. The Henry Nowak case just got even more damning after the verdict at Southampton Crown Court. A young native British student is murdered in cold blood. The killer tells a blatant lie about racism, and the police side with the attacker while Henry dies in handcuffs. In this updated case, we're going deep on the new details that have come out, the attacker's proven wicked lie, the policewoman laughing and ignoring that Henry had been fatally stabbed, and what the CPS and IRPC are doing now. This is two-tier policing at its most lethal. It shows exactly where Britain stands in 2026. On December 3rd, 2025, 18-year-old Henry Nowak was walking home from a night out in Portswood, Southampton. Vikram Digwa, 23, approached him unprovoked and stabbed him multiple times with a 21cm ceremonial Sikh knife. Henry tried to run but collapsed with fatal wounds. As he laid on the ground drowning in his own blood, Digwa immediately screamed that he'd been racially abused. The trial has been proven this was a wicked lie, told about a dying man. Prosecutors destroyed Digwa's self-defense story and the jury convicted him of murder. Digwa's own mother, Kiran Kura, was also found guilty of assisting an offender after she was removing the murder weapon from the scene. When police arrived, they took the attacker's word at face value. They handcuffed Henry while he was still conscious and pleading that he'd been fatally stabbed. One policewoman was heard laughing and dismissing his injuries, more concerned with the racism allegation than saving a British teenager's life. Officers only realised how serious it was when Henry became unconscious. They delayed proper first aid because they were too busy treating the victim as the criminal. Hampshire Police have now been forced to issue a public apology, and the Independent Office for Police Conduct, IRPC, has launched a full investigation into the officers' actions. This wasn't incompetence. This was two-tier policing in action, where native British lives are sacrificed to avoid any risk of a racism complaint. And let's be crystal clear here. This isn't just a bad batch problem or the civic nationalist rhetoric that we all heard and talked about, that it's only just Muslims that do terror attacks. It's all types of immigration, legal and illegal, from every corner of the world, that has flooded Britain and created the conditions for two-tier policing and demographic replacement. Every wave, every group, every enrichment scheme has diluted native British identity and forced the system to protect the newcomers at the expense of our own people. The elite don't care which flag or religion they come from. The goal is replacement, full stop. Henry Nowak paid with his life for that reality. The CPS got the murder conviction, but the real failure is the policing culture that let this happen in the first place. This case proves voting changes nothing, and the fundamentals stay the same no matter who's in number 10. The British boy died in handcuffs because the system cared more about the attacker's feelings than his own life. This is the Britain that has all been created. So anyway guys, hope you enjoyed this video about me talking about the Henry Nowak case, and the reason I'm talking about this case again is because of how important it is to kind of emphasise why this two-tier injustice has happened. And there's also been some updates about the case and even more details about what went on that night, on that day when Henry Nowak lost his life, all from a brown foreign untermensch. And because why this has happened was essentially quite a double standard with two-tier injustice, not just in the West, but also to do with places like with the US and also the UK. And I'd like to make a comparison between, I guess, especially to do with George Floyd and also to do with how the media blatantly cover it and are completely biased, especially because of how anti-white it is. And if you look at what happened with, for example, the Manchester airport, where these two lads were basically kicked in the head and tasered, but they were the ones that altercated it in the first place. Now, obviously, it's a bit of a sensitive subject to talk about George Floyd, but I think when it comes down to it, that Chauvin probably did have his own biases, and obviously if you look at the case properly, and unlike what other people may think, I only deal in fact-based evidence, and because of this, I think it's really important to emphasise that Chauvin obviously maybe have been a little bit corrupt, or maybe it would be a case of police brutality. But the thing, and the important thing to emphasise and to note, is that the media will be always biased towards a white cop killing a black person, the same with a Pakistani or even a Sikh like in the UK. And because of this, you see this double standard highly in the media. And when it came down to them showing the footage, whether that's the Manchester with them getting their head stumped on, and the same with Derek Chauvin putting the knee on George Floyd's back or neck, or whatever happened. And because of this, you see this happen where the media always portray white people as evil racists, and also blacks or non-whites as the villains. And because of this really does emphasise the point that when you see all of this happen in, whether you see it in America or you see it in the UK, you see the two-tier injustice, whether that's a Ukrainian refugee in America who was stabbed to death by a black man and the media covering it. And when it comes down to the whole victim mentality, I think this comes from a very, not broker culture, but obviously to do with, obviously I've talked about this before in the last video, to do with Henry Nowak, where basically people come from low IQ nations or high incest rates, and that will impact their genetics, especially to do with the missing prefrontal cortex not being developed in the brain enough. And because of this, it makes them have low impulse control. Now, if you look at the details of the Henry Nowak case, what ended up happening was essentially Henry got a bit drunk. Now, obviously, you could say that, that Digwehr was, in quote, protecting himself. But the problem with this is that in the UK, there is actually a loophole in the law. Well, not a loophole per se, but he said basically you are allowed to keep religious, I guess in this case, knives. There is a thing in Sikh culture where they can carry knives on them, or even to do with, for example, when they're on motorbikes, they're allowed to keep their turban on. And because of this, they are allowed to keep certain religious items that can even be used as a weapon. But the problem is that this whole self-defense thing's a load of nonsense, because obviously Digwehr lied, his mother lied, and even protected his son. And this goes into non-white communities protecting their own, even at the cost of whitey. And when you see this happen where Digwehr's family protected him, and the same with the Baki grooming gangs, where basically what ended up happening was that they pretty much protected them, and not just that, but also there's the police, the corrupt police force, and also to do with the social services, and also to do with how the BBC never covered it many years ago when this was all slowly coming about, I guess, the Baki grooming gangs, when basically they would not even talk about this and try to oppress it as much as possible. And I'd like to emphasize that when that happened, when Henry got a bit drunk, he was basically just trying to have a laugh with him, like you would see, oh yeah, that's pretty crazy, when you would be intoxicated. He wasn't ever wasn't even racially abusive towards Digwehr. In fact, he probably doesn't even have a record of being racially abusive. It's not like he has a troll account online, calling people the N-word or the K-word or the F-word or any of those types of things. And Henry just seemed like a kind of like a normal uni lad. He had a girlfriend, he had family, he would basically had hopes and dreams, and this was all taken away by a brown foreigner who pulled a knife on him and went and took his life, all because of his undeveloped prefrontal cortex. And when that came down to Henry, the media didn't try to necessarily make him look like he was a perpetrator, but the whole lying stuff with, Digwehr, the reason why he would basically, like what Browns do, is they have a victim mentality, whether that's colonialism or slavery, why they did slavery and shit, that usual bollocks, and pulled out this race card and told the police that was being racially abused. And this is why the women that came over to arrest Henry basically just dismissed him and basically just said, oh, he's just being a nasty racist, when, he clearly wasn't. And do you know what I find highly incompetent of the police is that basically these women are clearly DI hires, they're clearly fucking retarded, that they can't work out a fucking teenager has been stabbed by this untermensch And they can't work out the fact that, he's clearly bleeding to death. It'd be very obvious, there's a big, massive pool of blood, but for some reason they thought it was just, I don't know, they probably thought he went to fucking McDonald's and got a bunch of packets of ketchup and thought, oh, he just smeared them on himself to try and get out of, allegedly being racially abusive. But obviously, as soon as he went unconscious, the police were like, oh, fuck, turns out that he is. And like I said, to do with the Irene and the work UK police, like what happened with, for example, Pete North when he was arrested because he said, in quote, fuck Hamas, an organization, and obviously Islam is a religion. And because of this, he said all of this stuff online. He got in trouble with the police because the police are basically bored, got nothing better to do, actual criminals or investigate packet grooming gangs. No, what they actually do is they target white people in their own country and investigate them for being racially abusive allegedly. And because of you see all of this double standard, it really just enrage people and it just make people angry. And I understand this, especially what happens to do with these types of cases, and especially with those lads that were in Manchester. Apparently they actually did get off with it, but they didn't. I'm not sure if they've been charged with assault, but they got off with at least one charge. And you see this two-tier injustice in action, and this goes for anyone else like Chris O'Donnell or anyone else like Lee Rigby. They have their lives taken by brown foreign subversives. But it's not just a case of them doing this, it's the state that have allowed them to let them in, both legal and illegal, and basically allow them to develop their own cultures, and basically, they end up becoming hating each other. And that includes tagging the native population. And, this comes into this basically just them acting and talking bioweapons towards white people. And obviously people say I'm being very aggressive in this, but it really just emphasises how disgusting this has happened. Like, imagine someone lying about you after you've just ended up basically murking them. It just basically doesn't make any sense, and essentially just getting out of it because, you're just playing whitey. And you could say that, people shouldn't be racially abusive in these cases, but again, pulling the race card in this context is just completely just disgusting. Like, I can't describe the words how disgusted I am that this happened, especially, his family and especially his girlfriend, just very horrible hardship that you're going to have to go over. And as well, if you want to go to the link in the description below with links to my other channels and Discord as well.